Patty Melman is a resident, first of all, let me tell you, she is a resident of Austin, Texas, but she was formerly from Washington, being born here in the District of Columbia. Prior to her study of the wild burro, she did field work in Africa with Jane Goodall in chimpanzee research. She has just again returned from Africa and the Serengeti Plains, where she completed a 7-month study of the black-backed jackals Now she's here to tell us of her work in the rugged areas of Death Valley. Her subjects, according to Webster, are quadrupeds smaller than a horse, having a shorter mane, shorter tail hairs, and long ears, or simply burros. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Patty Melman.
Thank you, Jerry. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. Burros were first introduced to the North American continent by the Spanish in the late 1400s. As the Spanish moved north and west, the burro went along. By the early 1500s, the burro was in New Mexico, and potentially since the early 1600s has been roaming free in the American Southwest. The mainstream of equid evolution occurred in North America. Native horses were present through the Pleistocene. But 12,000 years ago, 31 genera of large mammals became extinct, among them several species of equids. Through the use of pollen analysis, it has been determined that the plant environment occupied by these late Pleistocene animals has remained essentially the same. However, the demise of these animals does correlate with the arrival of Paleolithic man in the Northern Hemisphere, a new predator who, according to Dr. Paul Martin, may have been a primary contributor to the extinction of these large mammals. Thus, burros, though native to North Africa and alien and exotic to North America in the present sense, do represent lineages that in the fossil record have a long history in the United States. Burros are found in most of the western states as far north as Oregon and Idaho. They were protected by public law on national forests and BLM lands, but this law has been found unconstitutional. If they are to be properly managed and allowed to survive, systematic research and concerned enforcement by law is necessary. Protection under the law does not extend to national parks, and hence locales like Death Valley National Monument. My study area was over 120 square miles in the northern end of the Panamint Range in Death Valley National Monument. It was supported by the National Geographic Society, National Science Foundation, and I was provided with housing by the National Park Service. The males are browsing along slowly, lightly hedging each plant as they go. As an example of the extreme adaptability of these animals, cotton-top cactus is interesting to note. Here the female Tejas paws the top thorns off and then gnaws out the interior pulp. During the 20 months I was there, I only observed this 3 times, but it does illustrate how adaptable these animals are. She gives a low-level threat to her yearling. This is the only occasion on which I would see threatening overfood occurring, perhaps because she'd put so much energy into exposing it. The animals usually come in about once a day to nurse, except for females with very young foals of less than 2 months of age. A particularly interesting behavior noted here was that the females don't let their foals nurse whenever they want. From day one, foals are regulated as to how often they're allowed to nurse, and the reaction is usually one of frustration, kicking and bucking and nipping on ma. But the females are exposed to a lot of heat stress, and they're losing fluid to the foals whenever they nurse. An example of how much stress they're under is the fact that they come in 2 or 3 times a day to drink at the spring when they have the young foals. Until a foal is about 3 months of age, it doesn't drink from the spring, but merely dips its muzzle in and plays with the water. It's totally dependent on its mother for fluid. Of course, it means it doesn't have to compete for water at the spring, but it does impose a lot of stress on the female. Foals have very low contact with any other animal. Tonic approaches brandy, a 2-day-old male, and gets threatened away. A foal's only real contact is with its mother. It's well to keep in mind what the activity pattern of these animals is, especially since in filming one tends to see the more dynamic interactions, which really take up a very low portion of the animal's life. They spend about 51% of their time feeding, about 17% of the time resting or sleeping, 19% of the time standing around, about 9% walking, and less than 4% of their time is involved with social interactions. So that you're seeing a pretty skewed version of what the life of a burro is like. In order to examine the effect of different habitats on social organization, I spent a month during the summer of 1972 on Ossabaw Island, off the coast of Georgia. I was once again supported by National Geographic Society and the National Science Foundation, and it was made possible through the generosity of Eleanor West. While on the island, I was aided in research by Gail Musto. Ossabaw Island is very different from Death Valley, both lush and damp. And interestingly enough, the social organization was totally different. On the northeastern end of the island, there was a male named Loner who was associated most of the time with 4 females and their offspring, forming a semi-permanent group, something that was never observed in Death Valley. However, there were some marked similarities in behavior between the Burros and Ossabaw Island and Death Valley. Here too, even though water was more abundant, foals were not allowed to nurse whenever they wanted. And one could observe the same sorts of frustrated behavior, snorting through the nose, backing the ears, flicking the tail, bucking, and eventually biting on maw. It seemed that this regulation of nursing was a deeply ingrained behavior with the burros. Even domestic burros with available water, when a foal was just a day old, wouldn't allow the foal to nurse whenever it wanted. Thus, it seems that the burros that evolved in the arid, very dry deserts of North Africa in places such as the Danakil have maintained this behavior even through centuries of domestication. The objective of this research was to observe and analyze the behavior and ecology of wild burros. Data collected in a systematic fashion is needed if these animals are to be managed in a realistic fashion, for their role in the ecology of an area will potentially change as the habitat does in terms of animal and plant composition. These are controversial animals, considered to be varmints by many. Since they are exotics, Death Valley National Monument is moving towards totally eliminating them. But the park is full of exotics, be it the most dominant grass, Bromus rubens, or oleander introduced into campgrounds. Perhaps it would be more realistic and humane to regulate their numbers in accordance with available food. These animals have a long geological history in the U.S., and since our large herbivore fauna was depaupered as recently as 10,000 years ago, there should be room to allow the burros to roam free in locales that they have inhabited for hundreds of years.